Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Rozman dan ini Niaga AWANI. Kita mulakan dengan perkembangan kewangan di mana pencarum kumpulan simpanan wang pekerja KWSP dijangka menerima lebih 5.8% dividen bagi simpanan konvensional tahun lalu, menjadikannya kadar tertinggi dalam tempoh 3 tahun. Memetik laporan FMT, sumber memberitahu ia meningkat sedikit berbanding 5.5% yang diumumkan pada 2023 yang lalu.
Menurutnya lagi, kadar bagi simpanan syariah pula diramalkan antara 5.4% hingga 5.6%. Angka tersebut adalah anggaran selamat dan jumlah akhir dijangka diumumkan oleh KWSP pada awal Mac ini. Kadar berkenaan boleh menjadi yang tertinggi sejak 3 tahun lalu. Purata untuk 10 tahun lepas adalah 6%. Baru-baru ini beberapa ahli ekonomi berpandangan terdapat kemungkinan dividen tahun lalu melepasi 6% berdasarkan prestasi kukuh pada suku ketiga 2024. Bagi 9 bulan pertama tahun lalu, KWSP turut mencatatkan pendapatan RM57.57 bilion iaitu meningkat 20% daripada RM47.86 bilion dalam tempoh sama pada 2023. Bagaimanapun, sumber tersebut memaklumkan pencarum tidak boleh mengharapkan dividen terlalu tinggi memandangkan KWSP antara segelintir dana pensyen di dunia yang memberikan dividen berdasarkan pulangan direalisasikan dan sebenarnya ditunaikan selepas pelaburan dijual. Ia adalah untung dan rugi diperoleh selepas jualan dan pelaburan berbanding pulangan tidak direalisasikan. Untung atau rugi pelaburan masih dipegang. Ini dikategorikan sebagai jumlah pulangan. KWSP tidak mengasaskan dividen pada jumlah pulangan termasuk keuntungan atas kertas yang kemudiannya ditentukan prestasi pelaburan.
Dan sudah bersedia dalam talian untuk bantu kita fahami apakah antara faktor-faktor utama yang akan memberi kesan atau mempengaruhi kadar dividen ini. Kita mempersilakan Dr. Muhammad Al-Zanizam Abdul Rashid, merupakan Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad. Doktor, terima kasih kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Berdasarkan prestasi suka tahunan KWSP dan strategi pelaburan semasanya, adakah rakyat boleh menjangkakan dividen yang lebih tinggi seperti jangkaan lebih daripada 5.8% tahun ini, atau kita perlu bersedia untuk angka yang lebih dikatakan konservatif?
Okey, terima kasih Ina. Kalau kita melihat prestasi yang diumumkan oleh pihak KWSP sepanjang tahun lalu, kalau kita melihat data daripada untuk tempoh 9 bulan yang pertama, pendapatan kasar pelaburan KWSP telah pun meningkat sebanyak 20%. Dan saya kira peningkatan ini adalah sesuatu yang baik dan sudah pasti sepatutnya boleh menterjemahkan suatu kadar dividen yang begitu kompetitif lah. Dan kita pun telah menyaksikan pasaran equity global termasuk pasaran equity domestik juga mencatatkan suatu prestasi yang baik pada tahun lalu dengan peningkatan 2 angka. Kalau kita melihat angka FBMK LCI pada tahun 2024 telah meningkat sebanyak 12.9%. Kalau pasaran di Amerika Syarikat juga rata-ratanya kebanyakannya dalam indeks utama seperti S&P 500, Nasdaq, semuanya mencatatkan pertumbuhan kenaikan 2 angka. Jadi dengan berbekalkan data tersebut, bolehlah kita katakan dividen bagi tahun 2024 ni setidak-tidaknya bolehlah angka itu melebihi apa yang telah diumumkan pada tahun 2023. Namun mungkin pelbagai juga angka itu faktor yang akan diambil kira seperti mengambil kira pasaran pada pergi tahun ini yang mungkin dilihat akan lebih mencabar, dan itu juga memungkinkan pihak KWSP untuk lebih konservatif dalam pengumuman dividen mereka bagi tahun lalu.
Seperti yang Doktor kongsikan bahawa iaitu kadar dividen KWSP pada tahun 2024 mungkin lebih tinggi sedikit berbanding tahun 2023. Pada masa sama, mereka juga mengambil kira antara persekitaran ekonomi pasaran yang agak mencabar pada tahun lepas. Dan dengan ketidaktentuan pasaran global dan cabaran ekonomi domestik, bagaimana KWSP dapat memastikan keseimbangan antara risiko dan pulangan untuk mengekalkan dividen yang lebih kompetitif ini? Bantu kami faham situasi ini.
Okey, baik. Di sini peranan kepelbagaian portfolio KWSP itu memainkan peranan yang utama. Sekiranya kita melihat kelas asetnya itu, rata-ratanya memang sebahagian besarnya ada dalam security pendapatan tetap, iaitu sekitar 47%. Dan kemudian diikuti oleh pasaran equity iaitu 44%. Jadi kalau kita melihat dua kelas aset ini saja jelas menunjukkan terdapat satu keseimbangan dalam kepelbagaian portfolio KWSP kerana setiap kelas aset itu ada peranannya. Sebagai contoh, kalau kita lihat security pendapatan tetap ataupun fixed income instrument ni, peranannya selain daripada menjadi keuntungan ataupun pulangan, dia menjadi satu peranan untuk preserve ataupun memelihara capital ataupun modal KWSP. Bagi pasangan equity pula, peranannya ada lebih untuk meningkatkan lagi kadar pulangan lah kerana pulangan itu dilihat lebih tinggi. Jadi dengan dua ini saja pun kita dah dapat lihat kepelbagaian itu amat diutamakan, dan kemudian kepelbagaian portfolio ini bukan saja dari segi kelas aset tetapi dari segi faktor geografi. Memang kalau kita lihat KWSP pun telah mempunyai pendedahan dalam pasaran global dan juga pasaran tempatan. Jadi ini dua perkara ini saya kira akan dapat membantu KWSP dalam merencana pelaburan mereka, dan juga dibantu oleh pasukan pelaburan yang saya kira begitu pengalaman dan disokong oleh pasukan pendidikan pelaburan yang berpengalaman, dan ini sepatutnya akan membantu KWSP untuk mencapai satu keputusan yang lebih baik dalam membuat keputusan pelaburan bagi tahun 2025 ini.
Dan kita meneliti KWSP telah banyak melabur dalam aset luar negara. Doktor, sejauh manakah strategi ini membantu prestasi keseluruhan dana? Dan adakah perubahan geopolitik seperti ketegangan Amerika Syarikat dan China mengubah pendekatan pelaburan KWSP?
Kalau kita lihat dalam prestasi yang lepas, memang strategi pelaburan di peringkat global ini telah pun menghasilkan suatu pulangan yang baiklah, dan boleh dikatakan suatu strategi pelaburan yang tepat. Tapi pada masa yang sama juga, strategi pelaburan ini bukan bersifat statik, dan kalau kita perhatikan dalam tempoh setahun, dua tahun yang lepas ni, terdapat suatu penekanan untuk melabur di dalam peringkat pasaran domestik, dan saya kira ada pelbagai platform yang akan digunakan seperti Gear Up dan sebagainya untuk meningkatkan pelaburan dalam sektor domestik. Dan dari segi kelas asetnya seperti saya sebutkan tadi, selain daripada security pendapatan tetap, selain daripada pasaran equity, kita ada juga satu pasaran dipanggil pasaran private markets yang juga menjadi suatu tunggak dalam strategi pelaburan KWSP. Jadi saya kira sekali lagi berpandukan kepada kepelbagaian aset dan juga apa dikatakan sebagai strategic asset allocation ini ataupun SAA juga akan membantu dalam bagaimana sesuatu keputusan pelaburan itu dilaksanakan.
Dan apabila kita bercakap mengenai persekitaran ekonomi pasaran di peringkat global pula dengan kembalinya Donald Trump 2.0 dan kemungkinan dasar America First yang lebih agresif, bagaimana KWSP menyesuaikan strategi pelaburan untuk menghadapi risiko global seperti peningkatan tarif dan ketidaktentuan pasaran kewangan, Doktor?
Memang tahun ini saya kira memang mencabarlah kerana dengan adanya pentadbiran baru di Amerika Syarikat, Donald Trump, dan kali ini Trump 2.0 ni berbeza dengan Trump 1.0, kerana Trump 2.0 ni ada pengaruh daripada teknokrat seperti ataupun teknologis seperti Elon Musk yang saya kira begitu bakal merubah banyak landscape bagaimana dasar ekonomi dan juga geopolitik akan ditentukan. Jadi sudah pasti dengan situasi ini dia menimbulkan satu keadaan yang mana kita panggil dia sebagai uncertainties lah, ataupun ketidakpastian. Dan kebiasaannya ketidakpastian ini akan tidak digemari oleh pasaran keuangan, terutamanya pasaran yang berisiko tinggi seperti pasaran saham atau pasaran equity. Dan sekali lagi berbekalkan kepada kepelbagaian aset, dan kita tahu KWSP ini sangat konservatif dalam pendekatan pelaburan, dan kita dapat lihat dari segi kelas asetnya sebahagian besarnya adalah dalam security pendapatan tetap. Seharusnya dapat meminimumkan volatility ataupun kemerorapan pasaran pada tahun ini. Dan di sini saya rasa sebagai ahli KWSP, sepatutnya kita perlu caknalah dengan keadaan ini. Dan kalau katakanlah tahun 2024 kadar dividennya baik, kita perlu meletakkan suatu pengharapan yang realistik untuk dividen 2025 lah. Kerana saya sebutkan tadi tentang ketidakpastian itu, jadi sudah pasti risikonya tinggi, dan untuk mengharapkan dividen itu kekal naik itu, saya kira itu perlu kita uruskanlah dari segi expectationnya itu.
Di sebalik risiko ketidaktentuan ini, kita perlu penting untuk meneliti peluang juga. Adakah KWSP meneliti ataupun melihat peluang atau risiko yang lebih besar dalam pelaburan luar negara, terutamanya di rantau Asia, sekiranya geopolitik ini semakin tegang, Doktor?
Okey, kalau kita lihat sekarang ni, saya nampak dengan adanya pendapatan Trump dan sebagainya, kemudian kita lihat bagaimana negara China menangani isu ini. Kita melihat negara China ni lebih meraihkan globalisasi, kerana ada mereka menyebutkan tentang untuk membawa kes ini kepada World Trade Organization dan sebagainya. Itu memberi satu impression bahawa negara China ini lebih orang kata tu praktikal dalam pendekatannya dan lebih orang kata tu meraihkan rule of law. Dan saya kira mungkin dengan situasi ini akan merubah bagaimana kita melihat negara China. Memang sebelum ini kita melihat negara China begitu tertekan akibat daripada perubahan dasar dan sebagainya. Tapi saya kira bila berlaku situasi ini, itu akan merubah bagaimana naratif pelaburan di negara China dan juga dalam rantau Asia ini juga akan orang kata tu memberi kesan. Jadi sudah pasti ini juga akan membuka peluang lah dari segi sudut pelaburan. Dan perkara ini akan sentiasa diteliti oleh mana-mana sahaja pelabur institusi, termasuklah juga pihak KWSP.
Dan Doktor melihat kepada tahun 2025, apa yang Doktor katakan tadi, apabila kita mengetahui keputusan kadar dividen KWSP pada tahun 2024, sudah tentu kita harus meletakkan iaitu jangkaan realistik pada tahun 2025 dan melihat kepada faktor-faktor ataupun sebab-sebab utama yang mempengaruhi kadar dividen KWSP 2024 seperti yang Doktor kongsikan. Apakah antara faktor-faktor utama daripada segi cabaran dan peluang yang akan membentuk kadar dividen KWSP pada tahun 2025?
Baik, kalau kita melihat trend kadar faedah peringkat global, sekarang ni kita melihat satu trend yang mana kadar faedah sedang dalam fasa menurun. Kita telah saksikan di Amerika Syarikat, di Eropah dan juga di negara-negara di rantau Asia telah pun memerlukan fasa penurunan kadar faedah. Dan kebiasaannya apabila fasa penurunan kadar faedah ini menunjukkan bahawa kedudukan ekonomi itu orang kata sedikit lembab, dan kerana ia memerlukan suatu bentuk campur tangan daripada pihak berkuasa, terutamanya dalam kes ini adalah dari segi Bank Pusat. Jadi ini merupakan satu signal lah bahawa pertumbuhan ekonomi itu mungkin menghadapi sedikit kelembapan dan memungkinkan kadar faedah untuk diturunkan. Jadi berbekalkan dengan dasar ataupun trend yang sedang kita saksikan, ini bererti kedudukan pasaran keuangan itu mungkin perlu kita nilai semula. Pasal itu saya katakan tadi, untuk menjangkakan kadar dividen itu kekal naik, itu saya rasa itu tidak realistik lah, kerana dia kena bergantung kepada keadaan ekonomi semasa, pasaran semasa, sentimen semasa, dan buat masa ni sentimen begitu berjaga-jaga. Dan kalau kita lihat dari segi dasar pula, dasar monetary buat masa ni dilihat begitu cenderung untuk orang kata tu pengurangan kadar faedah. Jadi saya kira itulah situasi yang perlu kita fahami dan cakna tentang apakah ia betul memberi kesan kepada prestasi pelaburan nanti.
Dan seperti yang apa yang kita boleh rangkumkan, Dr. Afzal Nizam berkongsi bahawa kadar dividen KWSP pada tahun 2024 dijangka akan mendapat prestasi ataupun keputusan yang lebih tinggi berbanding tahun sebelumnya. Dan walau apapun jangkaan dan harapan, ia harus berdasarkan keadaan ekonomi dan pasaran semasa dalam membentuk apa jua keputusan ataupun kita lihat kadar angka pelaburan ini. Sekali lagi saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, merupakan Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad, dan segala perkongsian ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astroawani.com dan di semua platform digital Astro Awani. Dan kita akan teruskan dengan perkembangan seterusnya, di mana mata wang, perkembangan perdagangan dan sentimen risiko yang meluas dijangka mempengaruhi ringgit yang diunjur diniagakan dalam julat 4.40 hingga 4.45 berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat pada minggu ini. Kenanga Investment Bank Berhad berkata dolar Amerika Syarikat juga berkemungkinan tidak memberi reaksi segera terhadap pengumuman tarif oleh Presiden Donald Trump sebagaimana dilihat pada Isnin lepas. Namun mata wang itu mungkin mengukuh sejurus pelaksanaannya.
Bank pelaburan itu berkata tumpuan juga masih kekal terhadap rundingan Amerika Syarikat China selain risiko tarif ke atas Kesatuan Eropah EU. Dalam nota penyelidikannya, Kenanga berkata terdapat tanda-tanda pasaran tenaga kerja Amerika yang lebih tepu dengan data tinjauan tawaran kerja, dan jumlah tenaga kerja negara maju itu memaparkan penyusutan tawaran kerja. Pelabur kini menunggu data penggajian bukan perladangan, sebarang simakan utama berkemungkinan memberi kesan ke atas dolar Amerika. Katanya angka yang lebih rendah memberi petunjuk pertumbuhan Amerika yang perlahan, namun angka inflasi pada minggu ini akan meningkatkan ketidaktentuan dasar Reserve Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat Fed.
Bursa Malaysia dijangka mengalami dagangan secara berhati-hati minggu ini dengan indeks FTSE Bursa Malaysia KLCI dijangka berubah-ubah antara 1,580 dan 1,600 mata menurut seorang penganalisis. Naib Presiden Penyelidikan Equity Rakuten Trade Sedang Berhad, Tong Pak Ling berkata, pemain pasaran mungkin akan menumpukan perhatian mereka pada sektor pembinaan, utiliti dan teknologi, memandangkan sentimen positif dan perkembangan terkini dalam sektor-sektor tersebut.
Beliau berkata prospek pasaran equity masih tidak menentu berikutan perang perdagangan antara Amerika Syarikat dan China. Katanya para peniaga mungkin perlu berhati-hati dan mengambil pendekatan tunggu dan lihat sebelum mengambil langkah seterusnya. Pengarah urusan SPI Asset Management Stephen Ines berkata, Bursa Malaysia menghampiri hujung minggu dengan gelombang optimisme disokong oleh jangkaan perang perdagangan ringan dan lonjakan sentimen Asia yang lebih luas, sebahagiannya dicetuskan oleh kemajuan teknologi dipacu kecerdasan buatan AI DeepSeek. Bagaimanapun dalam sentimen berhati-hati itu, keseimbangan risiko masih bergantung sepenuhnya pada dasar perdagangan Amerika dan sejauh mana agresifnya Presiden Amerika Donald Trump terhadap China. Beliau berkata 1 April merupakan tarikh penting apabila Trump mengarahkan penasihat perdagangannya untuk menyediakan pelan tindakan pelaksanaan tarif. Pasaran sehingga tarikh itu dilihat akan cenderung untuk jangkaan potensi langkah kompromi berbanding perang perdagangan yang agresif. Pasaran dijangka tidak mengalami penjualan besar-besaran selagi sentimen positif berterusan. Namun risiko tarif tambahan masih wujud dan ketidakpastian yang berpanjangan boleh menyebabkan pelabur kekal dalam mod tunggu dan lihat. Mereka dijangka bersikap optimis tetapi berhati-hati tanpa terlalu komited. Buat masa ini, sokongan diunjurkan sekitar 1,580, manakala rintangan berada berhampiran 1,610. Walau bagaimanapun, perubahan dalam dasar perdagangan Amerika minggu ini boleh mengubah keadaan dengan cepat. Kata Ines, dinasihatkan untuk harus cepat bertindak balas kerana pasaran ini masih sangat reaktif terhadap berita terkini mengenai perang perdagangan.
Ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan kini menjadi faktor utama yang mempengaruhi pasaran kewangan global. Pada Januari 2025, Joe Biden mengumumkan sekatan perdagangan berkaitan AI yang memberi kesan kepada sektor semikonduktor dan teknologi. Baru-baru ini, Presiden Trump pula mengumumkan tarikh perdagangan baharu sekaligus meningkatkan kebimbangan terhadap aliran perdagangan global. Perkembangan ini telah mencetuskan sentimen pelabur yang negatif menyebabkan reaksi pasar yang tidak menentu. FBM KLCI turut mencatatkan penurunan mencerminkan keterdedahan Malaysia kepada risiko luaran. Perbincangan ini akan meneliti mengapa ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan memberi kesan kepada sentimen pelabur dan sejauh mana kesannya dan berapa lama gangguan pasaran ini dijangka berlarutan. Dan sudah bersedia untuk ulas lebih lanjut adalah Muhammad Siddiq Jantan, merupakan Ketua Penyelidikan Pelaburan UOB Kayhian Wealth Advisor. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Siddiq kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami minggu ini lagi. Dan pertama sekali, apabila kita bercakap mengenai apa antara perkara yang pelabur perlu tahu dalam ketidakpastian dasar, mungkin boleh kongsikan kenapa ketidakpastian ataupun ketidaktentuan dasar perdagangan memberi kesan atau mempengaruhi sebahagian besar sentimen pelabur.
Okey, baik Nina. Kalau kita lihat ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan, dia beri kesan kepada sentimen pelabur kerana dia wujudkan ketidaktentuan dalam yang pertama kos perniagaan, yang kedua aliran perdagangan dan yang ketiga jangkaan keuntungan korporat. So pelabur bergantung kepada kestabilan dasar untuk membuat keputusan yang berinformasi dan perubahan secara tiba-tiba yang seperti Nina cakap yang Joe Biden kenakan sekatan AI dan juga Trump mengenakan tarif perdagangan. So seperti ini dan ianya berlaku tidak dijangka seawal Trump masuk ke White House dan pada hujung-hujung Joe Biden berakhir sebagai presiden, Joe Biden mengeluarkan sekatan AI. Ianya telah meningkatkan risiko untuk risiko dan juga ketidakpastian terhadap prospek ekonomi. Dan bila dasar perdagangan menjadi tidak menentu, so apa yang berlaku? Pasaran mengalami volatility yang tinggi sebab pelabur dia terpaksa react, menilai semula secara tergesa-gesa risiko dan menyesuaikan portfolio pelaburan mereka. So selain itu, perniagaan juga menghadapi kos operasi yang lebih tinggi, terutamanya jika kita lihat tarif atau sekatan meningkatkan harga bahan mentah dan produk perantaraan. So keadaan ini dia membawa kepada penurunan jangkaan keuntungan dan sekaligus dia melemahkan keyakinan pelabur terhadap sektor yang terjejas. So kalau kita lihat selain itu, ketidakpastian dasar dia mendorong kepada kelewatan dalam membuat keputusan. Seperti yang tadi Dina katakan, pelabur bersikap tunggu dan lihat. So bila tunggu dan lihat, so dia mendorong kepada kelewatan dalam membuat keputusan pelaburan, dan kerana syarikat cenderung dia menangguhkan rancangan pengembangan sehingga terdapat kepastian dasar. So ketidaktentuan dasar perniagaan juga memberi kesan kepada pasaran mata wang kerana pelabur akan beralih kepada aset selamat seperti emas, menyebabkan mata wang seperti ringgit mengalami tekanan. So secara keseluruhan, apa yang boleh saya katakan, ketidakpastian ni dia menghakis keyakinan pasaran dan mendorong aliran keluar modal serta kelemahan pasaran equity.
Jelas seperti yang Sidik kongsikan bahawa iaitu ketidakpastian pasar ini bukan hanya mempengaruhi atau memberi kesan kepada sentimen pelabur, tetapi ia memberi kesan kepada ketidaktentuan kos perniagaan, aliran perdagangan dan juga jangkaan keuntungan korporat kerana pelabur-pelabur ini sangat bergantung kepada kestabilan dasar. Jadi bagaimanakah reaksi pasaran terhadap sekatan AI oleh Biden dan tarif perdagangan oleh Trump ini, Sidik?
Okey, kalau kita lihat untuk bulan Januari, pasaran modal dia mengalami reaksi negatif terhadap kedua-dua pengumuman ini. So ianya mencerminkan kebimbangan pelabur terhadap gangguan ekonomi dan juga ketidakstabilan dasar. So sektor teknologi dan juga semikonduktor yang terjejas secara langsung oleh sekatan perdagangan berkaitan dengan AI mengalami penurunan harga kalau kita lihat yang paling ketara. So banyak syarikat walaupun sekatan ini tidak dikenakan terhadap Malaysia ataupun Malaysia tak mengalami sekatan AI ini, tapi banyak syarikat Malaysia yang membekalkan komponen kepada firma teknologi global turut menerima tekanan jualan. So pasaran secara keseluruhan menyaksikan jualan besar-besaran kerana pelabur dia bimbang tarif perdagangan Trump akan mencetuskan ketegangan perdagangan seperti yang berlaku pada tahun 2018 hingga 2019. So kalau kita lihat kalau kita lihat ketidakpastian ni juga dirasai di Malaysia. Kalau tadi kita tengok FBM KCI pada bulan 1 dia turun sebanyak 5%, lebih daripada 5%, di mana penurunan ini terutamanya bergantung kepada sektor ekspor seperti elektronik, pembuatan dan juga minyak kelapa sawit. So selain itu nilai ringgit juga melemah sedikit walaupun pada hujung-hujung dia menunjukkan peningkatan. Ini kerana pelabur dia beralih kepada masuk kepada bond ataupun pegang kepada emas. So ini menyebabkan pelabur cenderung bertindak balas terhadap perubahan dasar dan selalunya dengan menganggap senario yang paling buruk sehingga terdapat kepastian yang lebih jelas.
Dan Sidik ada berkongsi pada awal tadi mengatakan apabila pelabur-pelabur ini dalam keadaan berhati-hati tunggu dan lihat kerana ketidaktentuan pasaran ekonomi dan juga dasar perdagangan ini sendiri menyebabkan risiko yang meningkat seperti kelewatan dalam membuat keputusan itu. Selain daripada kesan ini, sejauh manakah kesan ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan boleh menjadi lebih teruk lagi?
Okey, kalau kita lihat tahap betapa teruknya kesan ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan ni, dia bergantung kepada skop dasar, persepsi pasaran terhadap risiko dan juga kesan limpahan ekonomi. So kalau skop dasar tu macam yang sekarang ni yang kita lalui adalah untuk Biden dia punya skop dasar adalah AI. Tapi untuk Trump tarif dikenakan terhadap semua barangan di China, tarif tambahan. So skop dasar itu ada yang mengecil, ada yang spesifik dan ada juga yang general. So jika tarif atau sekatan memberi kesan kepada industri penting seperti AI, iaitu teknologi dan juga pembuatan, impact dia akan menjadi lebih luas kepada industri yang lebih luas dan juga berpanjangan. So sentimen pelabur akan menjadi semakin negatif apabila pasaran percaya bahawa ketidakpastian akan berlanjutan atau meningkatkan kepada konflik perdagangan yang lebih besar. So kalau kita boleh lihat waktu Trump masuk jadi Presiden US untuk term yang pertama, iaitu pada 2018-2019, pasaran global dia mengalami penjualan besar-besaran. So yang paling tertekan pada waktu itu adalah pasaran China. Dan bila pasaran China kena, seluruh pasaran di Asia juga terima tempias. So kerana pelabur bimbang gangguan rantaian bekalan dan juga kelembapan pertumbuhan ekonomi dunia. So pada masanya sama, syarikat-syarikat kalau kita lihat menangguhkan pelaburan modal mereka dan juga menyebabkan kelembapan pertumbuhan keuntungan korporat dan juga secara asas dia KDNK negara. So kalau Malaysia, kalau kita lihat sebagai sebuah ekonomi yang bergantung kepada perdagangan, amat terdedah kepada perubahan dasar perdagangan global. So jika ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan ini berlanjutan, ia boleh membawa kepada penurunan pelaburan langsung FDI. Walaupun kita ada keluarkan dasar-dasar yang untuk menarik pelabur asing, tapi ianya akan menyebabkan penurunan pelaburan FDI, aliran keluar modal yang kita boleh lihat pada bulan 11, 12 dan bulan 1, dan pertumbuhan ekonomi yang lemah. So sekiranya tarif Trump ni dia berkembang menjadi konflik perdagangan yang lebih besar, dia lagi memberi kesan kepada sentimen pelabur sepanjang tahun 2025 dan menjejaskan pasaran dan memaksa syarikat untuk menyesuaikan strategi mereka. So strategi dia akan berubah dan syarikat akan kalau kita lihat syarikat akan meningkatkan pelaburan, tetapi pada 2025 apa yang dijangkakan akan menjadi sebaliknya.
Dan kita lihat tarif oleh Trump ini sudah tentu akan berpotensi untuk menjejaskan pada tahun pasaran ekonomi sepanjang tahun 2025. Tapi selalunya berapa lama kesan ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan biasanya berlarutan? Adakah akan melebihi ataupun akan berlanjutan sehingga tahun 2026 atau lebih?
Okey, kalau kita lihat tempoh, kalau kita nak ukur tempoh kesan ketidakdasar perdagangan ni, dia bergantung kepada sejauh mana bila Trump ataupun US sediakan dia punya dasar sekatan, dan kita kena lihat berapa lama parti yang lagi satu ataupun negara yang lagi satu reaksi terhadap ketidaktentuan itu ataupun reaksi terhadap tarif itu, dan juga apa yang mereka buat antara kedua-dua pihak ini untuk menyelesaikan ketidaktentuan ini. So dalam beberapa kes, ketidakpastian yang pertama kalau saya boleh katakan dia hanya berlangsung selama beberapa minggu atau bulan. So kalau kita lihat untuk yang AI yang dikeluarkan oleh Biden tu, ketidaktentuan pasaran tu dia akan menurun pada dalam masa 2 minggu, dan selepas itu menjadi kembali pulih. Dan waktu Trump menyatakan tarif ekonomi tarif perdagangan tu, kita lihat ekonomi reaksi pada dalam masa seminggu sahaja. So dianya bergantung kepada apakah reaksi dan juga sejauh mana kerajaan memberi kepastian. So saya boleh katakan reaksi ini boleh diukur dalam masa beberapa minggu hingga bulan, tetapi kita tidak melihat sentimen ataupun ketidakpastian ini memberi kesan ataupun yang buruk terhadap ekonomi lebih daripada 1 tahun. So kalau kita boleh ambil contoh lagi satu, iaitu pasal Brexit yang pada dahulunya dia menyebabkan volatility pasaran dan kelembapan pelaburan daripada tahun 2016 hingga tahun 2020. Tapi waktu itu kita boleh lihat kenapa Brexit dia lebih daripada 1 tahun, kerana ia melibatkan pelbagai negara dan juga menyebabkan kesan limpahan itu daripada beberapa sektor. Tapi kalau kita lihat untuk Amerika Syarikat dan juga China, kesan dia hanya dalam masa setahun saja sebelum mencapai perjanjian fasa 1, dan kesannya masih dirasai oleh beberapa sektor, tapi dalam persentage yang rendah. Artinya kita nampak kesan dia menurun. So melihat keadaan semasa, tarif perdagangan, kalau Dina tanya berapa lama, boleh saya katakan ianya memberi kesan dalam jangka masa tempoh 2025 ini sahaja, iaitu dalam masa setahun ini, dan bergantung kepada sama ada pertambahan mana-mana tarif perdagangan yang dinyatakan oleh Trump, iaitu bila Trump kata dia akan meningkatkan lagi kesan, so meningkatkan lagi tarif, so dia yang memberi kesan kepada keadaan, kepada ekonomi lebih daripada 1 tahun. So buat masa ini, walaupun kita lihat dua sekatan ni, dia hanya memberi kesan dalam masa dalam masa 1 tahun, iaitu tahun 2025.
Sidik, berbakikan kurang daripada 1 minit, mungkin kita nak lihat bergerak ke hadapan. Apakah langkah ataupun strategi yang boleh diambil oleh pelabur untuk menghadapi ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan?
So dalam tempoh ketidakpastian perdagangan, kalau kita nak kata apa yang pelabur boleh buat, yang saya boleh showkan adalah mengamalkan strategi pengurusan risiko bagi melindungi portfolio mereka daripada turun naik. So diversifikasi macam klise, tapi itu adalah salah satu yang boleh diterapkan. Tapi yang paling utama yang boleh saya nyatakan adalah sekiranya pelabur melihat penurunan mendadak, iaitu dalam masa seminggu terdapat penurunan sebanyak 6% ataupun 20% dalam masa seminggu, pelabur tidak patut untuk cut loss ataupun tidak patut menjual saham-saham mereka ataupun pegangan pelaburan mereka, tetapi perlu melihatnya sebagai peluang untuk menambahkan pelaburan mereka, kerana setiap kali yang kita nampak penurunan yang mendadak, ianya akan dituruti oleh market rebound. So ambil kesempatan adalah salah satu option, tapi berapa banyak penambahan pelaburan adalah bergantung kepada berapa banyak expose yang ada dalam portfolio. Saya cadangkan kalau pelaburan menurun sebanyak 20% dalam masa seminggu, pelabur boleh meningkatkan ataupun top up jumlah penurunan yang mereka lalui sahaja. Artinya tidak lebih, kerana kalau lebih ianya kemungkinan jika penurunan itu berterusan, ianya memberi kerugian terhadap portfolio pelaburan mereka.
Jelas bincangan kita menunjukkan ketidakpastian dasar perdagangan bukan sesuatu yang boleh diabaikan dengan sekatan AI oleh Joe Biden dan tarikh baharu oleh Trump menunjuk atau mencerminkan pasaran pada tahun ini sepanjang tahun akan mengalami gangguan. Namun dengan pelabur-pelabur yang mempunyai strategi yang jelas, fleksibel, mereka boleh menghadapi segala cabaran dengan lebih cekap dan lebih berkesan. Sekali lagi saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Muhammad Siddiq Jantan, Ketua Penyelidikan Pelaburan UOB Kikian Wealth Advisor, dan jangan ke mana-mana, Niaga Awani akan berhenti rehat seketika dan kembali selepas ini.
Kementerian Dalam Negeri memberi lampu hijau supaya pengesanan dadah dilakukan terhadap pengguna web.
Tahap integriti warga polis di Raja Malaysia PDRM masih membimbangkan walaupun peringatan dan amaran diberikan berulang kali.
Anwar menegaskan bahawa negara ini tidak mengiktiraf Israel secara de jure meskipun keberadaan negara itu di peringkat antarabangsa.
Malaysia tidak akan meminda peta sempadan maritim dan tetap mempertahankan kawasan dan kedaulatan negara di Laut Cina Selatan.
Kejahatan cuma wujud bila orang baik berdiam diri.
Iman tak salah.
Abah,
Kes terhadap Puan Zara digugurkan. I know I feel
kita belum kalah 300 juta.
Depan mata pun kau bagi lepas.
Aku tak ada niat pun nak bagi Jen kena tangkap.
One Cent Thief, Season 2. Stream episod baru setiap Jumaat on demand di Astro Citra dan Astro Go.
Prof, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's like an annual discussion between Prof Stefan. I want to talk about the understanding the development and also poverty. This is something that's very close to our heart in Malaysia and ASEAN, especially we are the chairman of ASEAN this year. We also have this discussion in World Economic Forum recently. I want to talk about because your work, you emphasizes a lot of about risk, resilience, and also poverty as well. But how do you see that the global understand the poverty evolved since pandemic COVID-19 and also since climate change and also post political instability currently?
So looking back a couple of decades, 3 decades or so, of course, we had an enormous improvement in the well-being and the welfare of the poorest groups in the world. You know, the World Bank would estimate that roughly from about 2 billion people living in extreme poverty, we went down to around 700 or 800 million people in the world. So this is since 1990. So this is massive progress. COVID, of course, stopped this progress, and we know this very well. And in all countries, we know that people prove to be very vulnerable to these kind of shocks, and indeed, poverty numbers shot up. But the good news is, globally, we're more or less back on the trajectory where we were by 2019. So actually, even though probably global poverty may well have increased in the extreme forms by about 100 million, 150 million, again, the progress, not least in Asia, has been actually quite positive. However, it illustrates very well of how precarious still these living conditions are. So if people talk about the extreme poverty, we talk about the most extreme thing. It's basically people who have purchasing power of about $2.15 in New York. Now, if you've ever been to New York or the US, you can't buy very much with $2.15. It would translate in Malaysia maybe in $1.50. You can't live on very much with $1.50. And so it's people below even that. So a lot of the population, at least in Asia and in the ASEAN, has, we have seen this progress over the last 3-4 decades, that they've moved above that line, but it's still a very precarious set of living conditions. And indeed, this is why, growth and development need to kind of continuously try to absorb a lot of these people, creating jobs and fulfilling the aspirations also of these poorer populations. So when we then look at climate change, it's again one of these big potential shocks that it could have. We see it already locally in particular settings where these extreme events happen. It's a bit like what COVID did at a global scale, locally, that a lot of people will be very precarious, pushed in. And again, it will take them several years to come back into their position. I don't think we should look at it as if suddenly the whole world impoverishes further at the same time. But what climate change does is make extreme events maybe not more regular, but definitely more intense. And so the kind of shocks that people have to experience will be really severe and pushing people that may have improved their living conditions a bit suddenly back into much more vulnerable and poor positions.
You mentioned about the $215 per day metrics, but do you believe that is still relevant, given that poverty is a thing that's it is basically a multi-dimensional, and then do you think that we should adopt more comprehensive multi-dimensional approach and metrics and so?
So there's a few things to be said about it. We use this metric largely because if we go back to 1990, a huge amount of people were below that line. So it's relevant in your society that has a good way of categorizing the most extreme forms of poverty. But of course, well-being is more than just about having $1.50 to consume. And so this is where you're right in saying, you know, that these poverty lines, as we use them within our societies, have to reflect social realities. In fact, most countries should have their own poverty line that is relevant for their society. Of course, you can't put a poverty line where, say, 95% of the population doesn't achieve it, because then it is meaningless again. It is, you know, think of the poverty line as a construct that tries to focus on a group of people that is very much marginalized. Should it be multidimensional? Of course, our lives are multidimensional. You know, we have all kinds of aspirations and not just having enough food. So yes, it should be, and again, it should reflect what is there in society. However, one important thing to recognize is that when we look over long periods of time, these multiple dimensions that people typically include, like health, education, and so on, and water and sanitation and so on, they move very closely together with this kind of poverty line. So for the kind of longer term trajectory, it doesn't quite matter whether we use multidimensional or whether we use what I was describing. The more important thing is that you draw a line somewhere that people in a society feel this will define someone who's deprived. And is this multiple or single dimensional? I don't matter that much. It's part of what society values, and then that needs to be reflected by that benchmark.
There's a conversation back in my country, Malaysia, about the absolute poverty, especially the absolute poverty line in Malaysia, in order to move up all this group above the absolute poverty line. But as we mentioned about the multidimensional, and also at the same time, we had this discussion in WEF as well about the planetary health, how it contributes to poverty in a lot of countries in the world. But how do you view the multi-pronged approach in tackling poverty, especially in regards to the planetary health as well? Because a lot of government seems to, you know, did not get the correlation between planetary health and also how it can contribute to poverty, especially in the global south countries.
So, look, when you are walking around some of the poorer, densely populated areas of Kuala Lumpur, if you walk around in any city in Malaysia, if you walk around any city in Asia, you know, you clearly see that environmental issues must be part of the well-being of people. For example, people talk a lot these days about lead pollution and the pollution that comes from the way water is distributed and indeed cooking happens, and all the kind of poisonous air that comes around and how it affects it. You know, we are definitely, if you're a poor city dweller, environmental matters clearly matter for you. So they should be part of your conceptualization of extreme poverty. And so, but there is another side to it that I want to allude to. You know, there's a lot of people say, well, we have to have this into our concept of poverty, and this, and this, and this. I've worked as an advisor in government, I've worked inside government. Now, the last thing you want to do is confuse the decision makers by trying to lump all these things together. And you get some kind of an index and say, oh, so many percentage of population is below some kind of multidimensional. The policymaker will ask, no, what do I do now? Oh no, we better take it apart again. And so don't underestimate the ability of a policymaker, of a decision maker, to actually separate, say, air pollution issues from material living standards issues, from food quality issues, and so on. Because that's how you do policy. You improve these things. So let's not make this debate something that in the end may give us a philosophically better concept, but practically quite a useless one for policy. So I'm a pragmatist in these things. Talk about all the things that you allude to, the multidimensionality, the aspects of deprivation, the different multidimensional aspects of deprivation in your country, but just keep them a little bit apart, because otherwise we have no idea of how to actually begin to deal with it. And just thinking the concept needs to be all together, it will probably confuse more than actually help. But yes, all these dimensions will matter, and the big problem for a policymaker will be the people who are affected, say, by intensive air pollution will, for example, be urban Malaysians. The people who are most affected probably still by very poor nutrition will be in East Malaysia, will be in the countryside. So the policymaker needs to make these trade-offs. Again, lumping it all together doesn't help anyone. Let's make sure we work on the food security of poor populations in one part of the country, in the countryside, work on the air pollution, and basically focus on those things that matter most for the most deprived people in the country in the different parts. But choices will need to be made, and let's not confuse.
Of course, the policy falls on the shoulder of the federal government. But in Malaysia and many Southeast Asia countries, we keep talking about decentralization in terms of policy and given more autonomy to the states and also the districts itself, because they know their people and the problem in that particular area. But how do you see this decentralization? Because in Southeast Asia, for instance, this is something sort of taboo to be discussed, and having autonomy in the particular state is something that we are not really, because it will open the door for corruption and all that. But how do you view, how do we strike a balance on this issue?
Well, you already allude to it. It has to be finding that balance, because the closer you get anything to do with policies that affect people very directly, social policies, things like health, education, nutrition, the closer you bring it to them, probably the better you will end up doing it. But the other risk is that you often decentralize to the lowest level of competence. And basically, and you allude to corruption, it's not just that, sometimes these things are really hard. Now, Malaysia, being the kind of educated groups it has, civil service that arguably should be competent, it will then, a lot will have to do with making sure the right people in charge at the local level to do these things. Just the illusion of saying, as long as we decentralize, it's good, we should just be very careful about. But it is a standard thing that the more capability governments develop, the richer countries become, the better it will be to decentralize as much as you can. Because, in Kuala Lumpur, it becomes very hard then to actually see the detail of the policy making that needs to be done in a particular district or something. So, yes, so move on that. But let's make sure, don't make it an ideology that decentralization must be the right answer to all problems, because then you see the problems of competence and corruption that you describe.
I want to talk about in the context of ASEAN as well, because we have Bangladesh who would like to join ASEAN, but at the same time, we have the advisor to the interim government, Professor Yunus, said that the ASEAN should have its own mold and also standard in terms of development and also tackling its own problems. But how do you view ASEAN, especially, moving away from the standard of development frameworks, in the sense that we've seen throughout the world?
Well, look, ASEAN, its emergence, its reflections, a lot to do with the trade bloc, with a place where certain things can happen. Of course, I myself come from Belgium, Brussels, center of the European Union. You see all the sides to this. There is a huge attraction to try to strengthen by forming a collective in all kinds of areas and setting up standards. The real issue becomes, again, in the conversation which is happening, do they reflect the nuance and the diversity of all the member states and all the cultural and political cultural things that are different? And at the same time, do you decentralize so much that actually the quality of delivery on the ground gets disrupted? So I have a huge admiration for Professor Yunus and the Bangladeshi government. I would call it the best and the most well-meaning government in the world at the moment. These individuals in there are amazing. And I think it's right to normatively put a challenge out to ASEAN. But let's be cautious of how, because in the end, normative principles need to be translated in practice. And we know all endless unions of countries that in words said all kinds of things, but in deeds couldn't deliver anything. So keep in mind, how could we deliver this in an ASEAN setup? I think it's an important organization, and it's relevant to strengthen it, but just always think, where can we add value and where can we make sure there is implementation possible, rather than lots of lofty standards and indeed the creation of new bureaucracies and so on that doesn't help anyone.
But based on your observation, do we get it right in terms of the practicality of and execution of all the policies in ASEAN especially?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on the detail. I just do remember that when I was working in the UK government, they were dying to become members. And, you know, if it is a club they were dying to be members of, you know, this kind of an interesting thing. It became one of our main foreign policy objective of the Foreign Secretary at the time I was working with, to actually become a member. So you must be doing something right, and you must be seen as either already or definitely potentially an important bloc that brings some balance in the kind of geopolitics, the geopolitical complexity of Asia as it is developing now. So I think it is a very valuable institution and it has its place. And you know, just look at all the Western countries that would like to have a good link with it. Yeah. You must be doing something right.
Right. As you know, that Malaysia is the trading nation, so we're quite open and we try to strike a balance between all countries. However, right now we've seen a lot of protectionism in many countries of the world, especially after Trump becoming the 47th US president, and we've seen few things being announced by him. But how do you see that all the efforts put in place being hindered by the protectionism, the characteristics that we have around the world?
Yeah. So look, we'll have to see how it all pans out. You know, every day there is a new development in the story around tariffs and so on, and how they're going to be used. So you know, in 2 weeks it may look very different. So, but a few things you have to keep in mind. And the one thing that worries me greatly is that in general, I worry that Trump may be right that actually it will pay for the US. And it's a very simple principle. There is something in economics talking about optimal tariff policy.
Right.
And that actually if you have market power, you can actually influence the price. And the US has in certain value chains, because of its massive consumer markets, quite a lot of influence. At the same time, it typically has most influence in those product areas where it has serious domestic industries that it could compete with. So this is where Canada should be more scared of it all than probably the ASEAN countries, because the industrial structures in Asia are very much complementary to what the US is producing itself. The basic consumer goods stills and so on. And in that sense, it's not for nothing that in the early days, Canada was threatened by 25% and China by 10%, because the technical people in the Trump administration will recognize that tariffs may be less effective relative to Asian countries.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think, as seen from Asia, you know, it's going to be rocky and it's going to be, you know, a stormy environment for a while. But there is potential. There are things that can be done. There are, and there is still opportunities to be taken. China in itself may be a little bit more complicated, but most of the other Asian countries can also take advantage of the decoupling. So actually, all these things may well be a massive opportunity for Asian countries and members of ASEAN, of many of the members. It will depend a bit on country by country, how they play the game relative to China versus the US. But many of them, and dare I say including Malaysia, are quite good at playing that game, that political game. And they will have to. But if they maneuver well, then actually the consequences may be a bit less than maybe sometimes people fear. I think for Europe and for Canada, it's probably far worse. That's where we have the same industrial structures than the US has. Therefore, tariffs going up will give a boost to their domestic industries in a way that we will not get in the same way for Asian economies.
Again, I want to quote Prof. Yunus, because he mentioned that the concentration of wealth is very important. And then at the same time, he gives an example of how we should have a bank that started off not just based on wealth and the certain part of the population, but also a bank that started off with the poverty community, for instance. But how practical it is to be implemented in terms of the ideas at current global state?
And are you referring to like the ideas of Professor Yunus and so on? Yes. Well, you know, while Professor Yunus is a great man and these ideas were very influential, the way they started out initially with microcredit by targeting the poorest people, most of the research evidence tells us that it actually doesn't work that well.
Oh.
His ideas were especially right for people that were not the very poorest. but a little bit above small enterprises, some other things and so on. Because, the bankability of the poorest is really tricky. We were referring earlier to their deep vulnerability, to their deep things. So a small thing that would happen is really, really difficult for very poor people to deal with. These days, we say for the very poorest, we're probably talking much more about things like social protection, cash transfers as the right way of buffering and helping them up in the world. But otherwise, a little bit higher up, banks that actually really target better some of these micro enterprises, some of these informal sector enterprises and so on. We have good examples in the world that actually built on Professor Yunus's ideas that actually can make it a marketable opportunity, that can be also profit making and so on. So these things are there. But always you have to remember, and that's a great lesson from Bangladesh we have to understand.
Yeah.
The return to all these intensive microcredit type of operations was also largely possible because the economy as a whole was growing. So it becomes a real bank that allowed very poor people to be included in the growth of the country. It's not in itself a solution for those countries, including in Asia, that are still quite stagnant. Because if the growth is not there, then actually these microcredit operations probably are not going to have these big returns. But the return will especially be high if, as a way of including poorer groups of the population, smaller enterprises and so on, into the growth overall. So yes, in that sense, it's a very powerful tool and more could be done. But there is a lot of it there, so there's a lot to be learned from. We should never be naive about it, and always be careful that we look at how effective they are. But there is a scope for progress there.
He also mentioned about how technology basically changed the youth in Bangladesh, and then it should be studied by the countries around the world. It's not just about the youth understand what's happening in the world and also their particular countries, but how do we solve problems? Now we talk about AI. In Working Forum, they talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, that will happen in the future. But how do you see the AI and the technological advancement, which is advanced so fast that we cannot catch up sometimes? Can help reduce the time frame in solving poverty issue, for instance. But how do you see this thing?
Well, there's one thing about AI, of course, and we start using it now all the time, is that it still does it all on the data that already exists.
Right.
It's not inventing new data. It's not an independent, but it processes it very effectively and does it all very, very well. So, as seen from poverty, it becomes a very fast learning tool from good experiences from other things. So it allows a much faster feedback mechanism to do the right things.
Right.
That's the first thing. It's still relatively new, we would say, but at some point a spreadsheet was also very new and everybody thought it would change all kinds of operations in business. We learn very quickly how to use it. Students, young people learn very quickly how to use it. And then, human intelligence tends to be still largely complementary to all these things that emerge. So if we find the right complementarities, yes, we can actually help to do very effective things. I'll give you an example that I have seen in AI that actually in poverty reduction can really help. So we do know that, and I alluded to it, there's a lot of good schemes, social protection schemes, targeted schemes for poor people, but often the problem is that poor people find it very hard to apply for these. So I saw actually, within weeks of ChatGPT emerging the first time, I saw in India, and it was of course typically again in Bangalore, people very quickly translated the whole thing in 27 languages and actually put a voice recognition on it, so that basically someone could just talk to a poor person about their living conditions, and AI filled in the entire application for the cash transfer without them having to do it. Now it's these things. So again, we can fasten, good things that exist but are hard to implement, we can increase their speed of actually making sure people can have access.
All right. Prof. Stefan, we don't have much time. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next year. There's some of the brilliant ideas that can be implemented, not just from ASEAN's perspective, Malaysia perspective, and also developing countries' perspective. Thank you so much again.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
melintasi Laut Cina Selatan hingga ke puncak Kinabalu, kami bawakan laporan ringkas, padat dan komprehensif. 5 minit Awani Sabah Plus setiap Khamis dan Jumaat 8.25 malam hanya di Astro Awani.
Apa signifikan dengan pengumuman ataupun berita yang keluar dari media China ini berkaitan dengan hasrat Malaysia untuk menyertai gabungan BRICS?
Kita mahu dapat lebih banyak umpamanya pelaburan daripada negara China.
Kalau melihat kepada Akta Kanak-Kanak 2001, adakah kita terlalu lambat untuk melihat proses untuk meminda akta sedia ada?
Kita perlu ada penyelarasan. Kita tak mahu bekerja secara silo.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kowski. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Today on Analysis, we discuss e-hailing industry, pricing mechanisms and sustainability. Now, the e-hailing industry has become a crucial part of urban mobility, especially in cities like Kuala Lumpur, due to high traffic congestion and limited public transportation options. Revenue within Malaysia's ride-hailing market is projected to reach 2.29 billion ringgit by the end of 2025. And as of January this year, there are approximately 2.9 million e-hailing drivers nationwide. The number of e-hailing service users is also growing, with a 21% increase in active users in key cities during the first half of 2024, as reported by popular e-hailing platform providers. Additionally, the number of users in the ride-hailing market is expected to reach a very healthy 11.47 million users by 2029. However, recent discussions around setting a minimum fare floor for e-hailing services has sparked controversy and the key issue of sustainability. In 2023, the Malaysian government proposed a floor price for fares in response to concerns about driver welfare and competition-driven low fares. The fare structure has been increasingly criticized for being unsustainable, particularly for part-time drivers who do make up a significant proportion of the ride-hailing workforce. Part-time drivers, often dependent on e-hailing to supplement their income, struggle with fluctuating demand, rising fuel costs, as well as vehicle maintenance. Now, according to a 2022 report, drivers' average earnings were often less than the minimum wage after factoring in these expenses, leading to dissatisfaction. So, with the introduction of the floor price, the government aimed to ensure drivers earn a livable income, but the move also sparked concerns about making services unaffordable for consumers. Balancing the needs of drivers with the demands of passengers in Kuala Lumpur, where traffic congestion and demand for rides are high, is a challenging task. Wan Agil Wan Hassan, founder with My Mobility Vision, joins me now in the studios for this extremely timely discussion and the path forward. Agil, a very good morning. Thank you so much for making time.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So a very interesting topic indeed, and one that you have been deeply involved in at the initial stages itself. So, Agil, let's get started off by discussing how Malaysia's e-hailing industry can actually sustain this rapid growth while also looking at the concerns that we have brought up about sustainability and also for consumers, especially in our urban hubs.
All right. I think before we go there, let's understand the e-hailing industries first, right? So, e-hailing industries came into the country back in 2014 when Grab and Uber formed the businesses. And ever since that, it became essential parts of our urban mobility. And of course, when it comes to mode of choice, with the lack of first mile, last mile connectivity to public transportation, people start to use e-hailing services to get from one point to another point. And along the way, people start to use, even though it's not always and all the time, people use e-hailing services to just satisfy their needs for mobility. And this will need the industry to make sure that they keep the fares transparent. While people keep on using e-hailing services because it's part of their mobility experience, they also need to be very transparent on fares. I know companies like Grab, Bolt, eAsia, Go, InDrive and Maxim have different ways of setting up fares. But this will allow, if the transparency happen, it will allow people to predict their cost of mobility, which will definitely allow them to use the service more. Of course, on top of that, we cannot forget about the enabler of the service, which is the drivers. So e-hailing companies also need to make sure that the drivers are well incentivized and make sure that they will be able to serve the public. Because without the drivers, there is no service can be provided, and it's like a chicken and egg situation. So you still need to take care of the public by not having too expensive fares, but you also need to make sure that the drivers have enough to bring home when it comes to this kind of service.
Exactly. Now, from what you've highlighted, Agil, what I'm also noting is that there is also an increasing shift to taxis for many end users because of the fact that fare increases during peak hours are really proving to be pretty unsustainable on the average commuter's pocket, who is also, in general, a 9-to-5 worker who just wants to get home in the quickest way possible, right, during peak hours.
Yes.
So from there, let's move on into looking at the significant role of e-hailing when it comes to urban mobility. So let's look at the potential long-term effects of actually imposing a minimum fare flow. That is, of course, the hottest and most controversial debated topic.
Exactly.
Is it good? Is it bad? Is it judicious? But looking at the big picture of the entire ecosystem and also raising the fact that drivers have their specific concerns.
Okay, let's go to the origin or the root cause of the problems. Now we know after 10 years, after 11 years of the existence of this industry, of course we can expect there will be problems when it comes to income and also fares. I mean, that's given. Now, the good part is when we introduce floor price, it will definitely address the concerns by the e-hailing drivers because, as you said, e-hailing drivers start to feel that whatever they made for the entire journey, the entire trip for a month is less than the minimum wage. That's what they claim. So we need to see that empirical studies. That's for a start. But let's say the floor price is installed, then it will cover or address their pain. But it will also give an impact to the fares. Because once the floor price is there, then the fares definitely will be increased. And this is the nature of demand and supply, the elasticity of fares. When you increase the price, the demand will drop. You might enjoy, as a driver, you might enjoy lucrative trips. One trip can be very expensive or at least make sense for the drivers, but it will start to not make sense to the users. So the users will start shying away from using the e-hailing services. So you have a lucrative trips, but you lose the chance and opportunity to make more trips because people will start weighing options of using a different services when it comes to wanting to get the e-hailing services. That's one. Number two, I think when it comes to stability, of course, this is the argument, the stability to the drivers. But what we're looking at is the stability to the entire ecosystems.
That's right.
I think it just makes sense for drivers to have more pace because they say that if you want me to serve, then I need to get paid more. Now, there's another component, which is the public. If you want me to use your service, I need to make sure that it is an affordable service.
Sure, and no demand, of course, reduced supply.
Now, there are the two components that we haven't discussed properly. The government, who are going to whether enforce or enable innovations, and the industry player who do have the technology that can help the government to make sure that it can be addressed through innovations. So floor price, in my views, but my personal view, is not the answer. I'm not saying that I'm against it totally. We might need to look into it, maybe have a flexible ways of having the floor price because of the differences between permanent and also temporary workers in the...
So a flexible floor price, that's the key that I'm picking up from you.
Flexible floor price. But again, let's have government and the industry player to work together to find innovative solutions to this.
So what would it look like, Agil, in ideally speaking, if the government is wanting to ensure that the welfare of these part-time e-hailing drivers is also adequately protected, but at the same time not wanting to compromise on ride-hailing services for the general public while our mass transit system is still in the works of ensuring maximum ridership and maximum coverage also?
Of course. So when we look at the part-time e-hailing drivers, right? So they have a different motivations when it comes to income. Because for them, it's all about making supplementary income because whatever I'm earning now is not enough. Or maybe...
Quite likely, yeah.
If it's just enough, then they want to make more so that they can have a better quality of life. That's given. But they also do not... I mean, they shouldn't go through the same hoops like the permanent e-hailing drivers, because they just come depends on whatever time availability that they have, or they have their set of time frame that they want to work in this industry. So government need to make sure that the regulation that will be imposed will not hurt them, because when you have over regulations, the part-time drivers will start feel the pain and they will leave. For example, I'm taking back the floor price argument, right?
Right.
It's not only about the part-time drivers. The small timers, the small companies who providing e-hailing services also will die off because they cannot keep up with the regulation change.
Stifling innovation, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
So going back to these part-time e-hailing drivers, we need to offer flexible solutions. For example, tiered regulations. Maybe they do not have to go through the same regulations like the permanent drivers, but they go into a tiered regulation where they need to comply on certain compulsory regulations. Flexible protection, for example. Maybe we can offer proper security packages for permanent drivers, but for part-time drivers, there must be a flexible package that will allow them to have important protections. For example, giving you a simple example, permanent workers might need the income protection when they've been hospitalized, they need the income replacement, but maybe not to the part-time drivers. I mean, there is no right or wrong here, because we still need to discuss about how flexible and how dynamics that we can make the regulations be. And of course, we need to incentivize them to make sure that they go to the underserved areas. So that let's not get them compete with the permanent e-hailing drivers in the same
within the same
areas.
zone.
Yeah,
correct.
Because we also know that they are, because technology will allow us to know that they are underserved areas, right? Let's incentivize them. Because they're part-time anyways, right? So those part-time drivers should be incentivized to go to underserved areas, so that those people in those areas will be able to access the healing services.
So that actually, it would be an extremely useful and interesting use of big tech, and using the fact that you can actually calculate and categorize the different drivers that you have within one structure, right? Okay, so from there though, Agil, I want to talk about the fact that we've got a projected increase for e-hailing users themselves by 2029, a couple of years down the road, but it's good to always look forward, right?
Quite impressed with the numbers.
Yes, exactly. A projected 11.47 million riders and users in Malaysia alone. So how is the industry that is already dealing with quite a few challenges right now when it comes to sustainability, etc., how will the growing demand for services actually be addressed? Because we're also going to be looking at traffic congestion and limited public transportation options, perhaps changing a little bit in flexibility, but if anything, the urban population is only going to increase.
Exactly. I think we always have this dilemma of first mile, last mile connectivity.
Very true, for decades.
Yeah, and using that argument and summarize it or conclude that our public transportation system in the city like KL is not up to standards or expectations by the public. I think it's time for us to really look into how we can unify the services that we have, because we have spent billions of dollars building infrastructures, right? And just having this first mile, last mile connectivity shouldn't let the public do not shift.
Exactly,
from
it's a constant thorn.
I mean, you cannot use that argument, I can't go to the train station because the first mile, last mile connectivity is not there. So let's have that partnership happen between e-hailing companies, which I know that it's happening between Grab and Prasarana, if I'm not mistaken, on the DRT services. But let's have more e-hailing companies to be part of that unified solutions.
Which would perhaps mean integrating the e-hailing services with maybe train, even bus schedules?
To allow the user to have a seamless transition from one mode to another modes, right? Because we know for a fact that if you want to go to the train station, it's either you take a bus, which God knows when it's going to arrive, or maybe you walk in the heat or in the rain.
That's right.
Or worst case is drive to the stations and end up you do not have parkings and you drive all the way to the destinations.
Very true. And in peak hours, urban commuters have a very fixed time allocation within which they need to get to destinations.
Exactly. That's one area that we can look at. The second area that we can look at is perhaps we can expand ride sharing to a really meaningful ride sharings.
All right, what would that look like, Agil?
Now, the e-hailing services is you own a car and then you serve the public. That's what people see ride sharing is all about. But ride sharing is the real ride sharing is about you sharing the car with other people's. I think Grab used to have this service before, but I don't know why it's not popular.
They've actually recently reintroduced it under a so-called saver option.
Yeah. So let's have that more, but supported by local council by allowing them to have the right of way. For example, if you have a traffic congestion, then you spare one lane for bus services and ride sharings. Allow them to enjoy that seamless travel experience and let those people who drive stuck in the congestions, allow them to have a parking priorities at the commercial areas.
Right.
So those kind of things, I think, that will allow industry to adapt with the growing demand, because then they will not be in the same situation like other traffic or other car users.
So basically offering a value-added option if you opt for ride-hailing.
Yes.
Fantastic. So then, though, however, let's say if a fare floor is introduced ultimately for Malaysia, Agil, could it also inadvertently lead to a rise in illegal or unregulated ride-sharing services? And if so, how can the policymakers, the government, address such potential risks if they are looking at actually rolling it out?
Okay. The first thing that when we discuss about the floor price of fare, we know for a fact that it will shy away the users, and then drivers might not be able to enjoy more trips while they're enjoying a lucrative one single trip.
Right.
Now, what will happen then? In my experience, when I was in SPAD back in 2012 until 2018, you know that these people will go to shadow, meaning that they will create an illegal e-hailing services.
Right.
We are Malaysians and we are very creative when it comes to solutions. I have to give that to us. But sometimes people will use that creativity to go beyond and not complying to the law.
Right.
So when they go to the underground providing illegal services, this is where it will create harm to the public, because illegal services, the public are not protected. The insurance is not going to cover for you. And when you are not using a proper mechanism as per the required by the law, then the entire system will collapse, because people will start looking at, oh, we shouldn't stay in the light because it's not enough for us. Let's go to the shadow because the illegal services will give us more money. And of course, while we want drivers to earn fair income, I think then fair floor price will help, but we need to be very careful on pushing these fares. I would suggest the government to really look into it together with the operators. Before we really go into pushing this agenda, let's find other options first. Perhaps I give you an example. When there is a dead mileage, when you book Grabs, for example, the drivers will pick you up, but the moment they pick you up until they're really picking you up, that mileage are not paid.
Yes, that's right.
That's the dead mileage. Then they'll start comparing with the trip they made for you. Then they'll start feeling that, oh, it's not enough.
Not worth it,
And
perhaps.
then some people will experience cancellations.
Very
trips,
true, very true. Yeah.
Now, assuming, I think there's companies trying to find a way of funding it. Fund the dead mileage, meaning that the calculation of fares will start from the moment you accept the booking, not from the moment you pick up the trips. So accept booking, kick in the fare, then you will have the fare count in the entire journey until you drop off. Now, but that money cannot be funded by operators just like that, because they need to increase fares. There is a component of that fares that belong to the operators, which is the commissions. But the commissions are capped by the government. What if we allow that commission to be dynamics? Then whatever money that made from that commissions, that threshold will go to the pool, then that money will go and fund the dead mileage. That is one of the innovations that we can explore, because the operators have the wealth of the data. They know which trip they can charge more commission, which trip they charge low commissions. Then it becomes win-win situation to everyone, to the operators, to the drivers, and also to the public.
Well worth considering, right? Which brings me naturally to the question, Agil, about so how can the e-hailing platforms themselves take more of a active stakeholdership role and collaborate with local authorities, public transport system services as well, so that we can have that more integrated and efficient system? Perhaps not today in 2025, but at least within the next 3 to 4 years.
Well, as I mentioned just now, there is a need to collaborate between public transport operators, e-hailing operators, local councils, to make sure that public will have a seamless journey experience. Like I said, connecting or marrying public transport like rail services and bus services with e-hailing services under one single payment, for example. So you do not have to make different payment all the time when you change modes. So you can also explore the idea of a discount e-hailing fares if you use that e-hailing services to train station, like what Singapore
as a supplement,
as a supplement, right? You can also have perhaps explore the unified mobile apps like mobility as a service, where people do not have to switch between platforms via different apps. So you can just use one apps, book the e-hailing services, know your bus schedule, pay your train tickets, get your micro-mobility, for example, which is yet to be regulated. So under one entire, one single platform called mobility as a service. And maybe you can even rent a car on that platforms. So this kind of technology innovations need to happen. Maybe not now. I mean, it's not a rocket science. The many countries have already explored it. But I think government need to seriously think about having that unified apps that allow everyone to use just one single window to move from one point to another point, even though using a multiple modes.
That multimodal integration of platforms, right?
Exactly.
Now, let's think about technology and data analytics, of which the back end of the e-hailing service providers, the platforms, they already have a wealth of it. So how can it help to improve pricing models and driver compensation systems in the meantime, as we're working on, hopefully, the government rolling out these one card to rule them all?
Okay. So I think one thing that we need to be very clear is that the owner of the technology definitely able to find ways, innovative ways to come up with the solutions. But they need to be guided by the government, and they need to get inputs from the drivers and publics. That is the framework that we should look at. The technology that they have, that allow them to do a predictive analysis. For example, after 10 years, can you imagine if a platform cannot predict what kind of traffics that we're looking at? Then it will allow them to predict what kind of fares that we are looking at. So this kind of predictive tools is already in place, but it needs to be empowered by the government and allow government to understand what kind of innovation that they can do with this kind of tools. That's number one. Number two, we also can use this tool to expand the services for better coverage.
Right.
Last decade, we didn't have any idea where the taxi is, right? You need to wait on the street and hail them if they are there. And the taxi didn't know where you are, even though you needed taxis. But today, there is accessibility and visibility of the services.
Live data as well.
It's a live data. So those kind of things will allow operators, platform operators, to expand the services to underserved areas, because they already have the demand data. That demand data will allow them to predict what kind of demand pattern will look like in the future. And of course, we also need to look into fair compensation beyond just more rides. I mean, we cannot just simply ask them to do more rides so that drivers can earn more, but having a proper analytics that allow operators to incentivize performer drivers. So those performer drivers should be incentivized, but of course, those incentives will cost them money. But government need to also be very relaxed on regulations that allow them to be more flexible in getting more income that will allow them to give back to the drivers.
Exactly.
So those kind of things, it must be like, it must be, I mean, government cannot be enforcers all the time. Governments need to be enabler. So they do not have the skill set, they do not have the technology, but they need to be able to guide the owner of the technology to do the right things. And this requires a proper collaborations and discussion. And it cannot just simply shove things into their throats. And these businesses will definitely retaliate.
Exactly. And also whether or not the businesses survive, or is it only going to be the monopolies that are allowed to?
That's another thing.
Exactly. So, Agil, let's end out the discussion perhaps with some final thoughts that you have actually about introduction of a minimum fare floor, but how it can also lead to environmental impacts, which perhaps are not even the focus right now, but definitely we already do know that urban and traffic congestion does lead to excessive levels of CO2 in the air, and also the level of air quality.
Of course. I think when you push the floor price, as we discussed earlier, you will get less trips, right? But less trip doesn't mean that you are not going to pollute the environment, because you are getting those cars idling around without customers.
There you go.
That is a simple understanding how the floor price impact towards the environment. That's number one. Number two, when people start to feel that it is expensive and not affordable enough to use e-hailing services, those people who have access to cars will start driving back. Whether they drive to the stations, and then they drive to the station, they couldn't get a parking, and then they just drive all the way to the destination, or maybe they just decided to drive all the way, right? And you have more cars on the roads, and we already have what? We already lose 54 to 56 million a year when it comes to burning of fuels. Just imagine about that. What kind of environment that we are? Yeah, that's how the environment situation looks like. And of course, if we want to, we need to make sure that it aligns with our SDG agenda.
Sure.
So we also very loud about environment crisis, climate crisis. We are very loud about green mobility. But these simple solutions of trying to solve the income matters will definitely not going to align with our green agenda.
Fantastically put. Agil, thank you so much for the discussion and all the insights. We really hope the right stakeholders are listening.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. We'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. I'm Tamina Kaustri signing off for now. Here's to a productive week ahead.
Debaran semakin terasa. JDT memanfaatkan sepenuhnya peluang. Satu kesilapan mampu memusnahkan segalanya. Tekanan semakin memuncak. Sang gegasi kini berjuang ke pusingan seterusnya.
That was unstoppable.
AFC Champions League Elite. Secara langsung di Astro.
Sign the resignation letter and you are completely become my housewife.
Kifarah mendatang.
Dia dapat apa yang dia idamkan. Ya, bijak. Aku nak kau terus semangat, Syah.
Kakak, abang Is pukul akak lagi Siapa tu?
Pilihan yang memakan diri.
Syah, tolong Mr. Chen pukul Abang jangan berpenjara.
Jangan pergi ke Jamara.
Jangan niat bahaya, kan?
Adakah konflik ini bakal berakhir?
Kau buat apa dengan Is?
Minggu akhir, curang tanpa niat di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Penyasaran subsidi diesel di Semenanjung tidak akan memberi kesan kepada harga barangan keperluan di Sabah, Sarawak dan Labuan.
660 individu berusia bawah 21 tahun di Sarawak telah diberikan kewarganegaraan.
Sarawak kini menjalinkan kerjasama dengan Bank Dunia dalam menjayakan perdagangan karbonnya.
Tiger Woods hosts the Games Elite in Hollywood at the iconic Riviera Country Club. Legacies are defined, legends are born, and the stars shine brightest at the Genesis Invitational.
Perang dagang yang dikenakan oleh Amerika Syarikat di bawah pentadbiran Donald Trump yang terbaru ini dengan mengenakan tarif kepada jiran mereka iaitu Kanada dan juga Mexico di selatan 25%. Begitu juga tambahan 10% kepada barangan yang diimport dari negara China dengan tarif yang sememangnya sudah tinggi dikenakan China kepada China sejak pentadbiran Trump 1.0 dan juga pentadbiran Biden pada penggal yang lalu. Dan bagaimana perdagangan ataupun perang tarif ini ataupun perang dagang ini akan memberi impak kepada dagangan Malaysia ataupun